Imagine a place that looks like a dream, rolling green hills, exotic animals roaming freely, elegant buildings glowing under the sun. To visitors, it feels peaceful, even magical. But beneath this beauty lies a darker story. A story of ambition without limits, power without mercy, and a family determined to rule an empire at any cost. Grant's Farm was never meant to be just a home. It was designed as a statement. When the Busch family acquired this land, they didn't want a quiet retreat. They wanted a symbol. A living monument to success. A reminder to America that beer didn't just fill bottles, it built empires. The family behind it began with struggle. Immigrants with nothing but hunger and determination. That hunger never faded. As Anheuser-Busch grew, so did the desire for control. Beer flowed through the nation, but power flowed through the Busch bloodline. Grant's Farm became the heart of that power, a place where deals were whispered, futures decided, and loyalty tested. Behind the mansion's walls, life was tightly controlled. Servants lived by strict rules. Workers were expected to be invisible. Smiles were required. Silence was enforced. Every detail was curated to project perfection, while mistakes were buried deep. The estate wasn't just a home, it was a stage, and everyone had a role. Even the animals roaming the farm weren't just for beauty. They were symbols of dominance over nature, trophies of wealth, distractions for the public. Visitors saw freedom and generosity. What they didn't see was how carefully everything was managed to protect the family image. Inside the family itself, cracks began to form. Enormous wealth created enormous pressure. Children were raised not just as heirs, but as guardians of a legacy they never chose. Love competed with expectation. Failure was not an option. The mansion heard arguments echo through marble halls, witnessed broken relationships, and absorbed secrets that never reached daylight. Alcohol built the empire, but it also haunted it. Addiction, denial, and excess became silent guests at the estate. The very product that made the family untouchable slowly corroded them from within. Power insulated them from consequences, until it didn't. Grant's Farm also served as a shield. By opening parts of it to the public, the Busch family created goodwill, admiration, and distraction. Few questioned what happened beyond the guided paths. Fewer still dared to challenge a family that controlled jobs, money, and influence. Over time, the mansion became less of a paradise and more of a reminder. A reminder that when wealth grows too fast, humanity often lags behind. That behind America's beloved beer empire stood a family willing to sacrifice privacy, peace, and sometimes people to stay on top. Grant's Farm still stands today, quiet and beautiful. But if its walls could speak, they wouldn't tell stories of picnics and animals. They would tell stories of power, fear, ambition, and the heavy price paid for building an empire that was never meant to fall. The mansion at Grant's Farm was never intended to be a simple residence or a peaceful countryside retreat. From its very conception, it was engineered as a physical declaration of dominance. Every acre of land, every stone in the walls, and every carefully planned view was meant to communicate one message: power lives here. This was not a home built for comfort alone, but a fortress of influence designed to remind anyone who entered, or even passed nearby, who truly held authority. The sheer scale of the estate was deliberate. Vast open spaces were not about beauty, they were about separation. Distance from the outside world meant distance from accountability. The mansion stood elevated, both literally and symbolically, above ordinary people. Wealth was not hidden here, it was displayed boldly, almost aggressively. Expensive architecture, imported materials, and grand layouts were chosen not because they were necessary, but because they were excessive. Excess itself became the language of control. Power was embedded into the design. Long driveways forced visitors to approach slowly, giving them time to absorb the size and dominance of the property. Gates and boundaries marked clear divisions. Those who belonged inside and those who did not. Once within the mansion, the layout reinforced hierarchy. Certain rooms were meant for command, others for obedience. Movement was controlled. Access was restricted. Even silence had a purpose. Wealth, here, was not about enjoyment, it was about insulation. The mansion shielded its owners from criticism, law, and consequence. Inside its walls, decisions could be made that affected thousands of workers, entire industries, and even politics, without the noise of the outside world interfering. Money built a barrier, so thick that reality struggled to penetrate it. Control extended beyond people to nature itself. The surrounding land was tamed, reshaped, and displayed as proof that nothing, neither man nor animal, existed beyond the family's authority. What appeared to visitors as harmony was actually order enforced by wealth. Every tree planted, every animal placed, every path carved into the land reinforced the idea that power was absolute and unquestioned. The mansion also served as a psychological weapon. To employees, it inspired awe and fear. To guests, it created admiration mixed with intimidation. To rivals, it was a warning. This was not just where a powerful family lived. It was where power was performed. The building itself became part of the empire, silently asserting dominance, even when no words were spoken. Behind closed doors, the mansion functioned like a command center. Strategies were shaped, alliances formed, and threats neutralized, all under the illusion of elegance and tradition. Control here was subtle but total. Loyalty was expected, silence was demanded, and dissent had no place to survive. In this way, the mansion at Grant's Farm was far more than architecture. It was ideology made physical, a monument to the belief that enough wealth can rewrite rules, bend morality, and place a family above scrutiny. It stood not as a shelter from the world, but as a reminder that the world, in many ways, revolved around those who lived inside its walls. The rise of the Busch family began far from luxury, power, or certainty. It started with displacement, with immigrants arriving in America, carrying little more than ambition and fear of failure. They entered a country that promised opportunity, but offered no mercy. Survival demanded toughness, and that toughness slowly hardened into something colder. What began as a struggle to belong evolved into a determination to dominate. At the center of this transformation stood Adolphus Busch, a man who understood early that success in America was not about fairness, but about control. He didn't just want to make beer, he wanted to own the system that sold it, transported it, advertised it, and normalized it. While others brewed locally, he thought nationally. While competitors played by tradition, he reshaped the rules. Beer became the perfect weapon. It was legal, addictive, culturally accepted, and endlessly profitable. Through relentless expansion, aggressive marketing, and strategic alliances, Anheuser-Busch grew beyond a business into a force. Taverns depended on it. Workers relied on it. Cities bent around it. The family learned quickly that when people rely on what you sell, they also rely on you. As wealth poured in, so did influence. Money opened doors that were once locked to immigrants. Politicians listened. Laws softened. Rivals disappeared or were absorbed. The family no longer asked for permission. They expected cooperation. What had once been survival instincts transformed into entitlement. They were no longer guests in America's economy. They were architects of it. With each generation, the struggle that built the empire faded, but the hunger remained. Children born into privilege were raised with one message drilled into them: this empire must never weaken. Failure was not personal. It was betrayal. The family name became a brand, and the brand became sacred. Emotion was secondary to legacy. Over time, their wealth reached a point where consequences stopped applying. Economic downturns didn't touch them. Social criticism slid off them. Prohibition, which destroyed countless breweries, only proved their resilience and political strength. While others fell, the Busch Empire adapted, survived, and emerged even stronger. Untouchable was no longer a reputation, it was a reality. The transformation was complete. The descendants of immigrants, who once feared being ignored, now commanded an industry that shaped American culture itself. Beer bottles carried not just alcohol, but authority. Advertising shaped identity. Sponsorships bought loyalty. The family no longer needed to announce their power. It was assumed. Behind the public image of tradition and Americana stood a dynasty forged by pressure, sharpened by ambition, and protected by wealth so vast it distorted reality. The journey from struggle to royalty was not gentle, not noble, and not accidental. It was calculated, relentless, and deeply human in its refusal to ever be vulnerable again. Anheuser-Busch was never meant to exist as a simple producer of beer. From its rise in the late 19th century, it evolved into something far more powerful, a machine that influenced how Americans drank, thought, voted, and even identified themselves. Beer was only the surface. Beneath it operated a complex system of money, messaging, and leverage that reached deep into politics and culture. Politically, the company learned early that survival depended on influence. Laws could destroy breweries overnight, and regulations could suffocate profits. So, Anheuser-Busch did not wait for governments to act. It positioned itself close to power. Politicians were courted, campaigns quietly supported, and policies subtly shaped. The brewery became a familiar presence in political circles, not as a threat, but as a benefactor. When lawmakers debated alcohol regulations, they weren't just debating morality. They were negotiating with one of the most powerful economic forces in the country. During moments of national crisis, the company aligned itself carefully with patriotism. Beer was wrapped in American identity, sold as tradition, masculinity, and unity. Drinking wasn't just recreation. It was framed as participation in the American story. This cultural strategy made criticism dangerous. To challenge the company was to risk being seen as un-American, anti-worker, or anti-tradition. Culturally, Anheuser-Busch mastered mass influence long before the age of social media. Advertising didn't just promote products, it shaped values. Their commercials defined what it meant to relax, celebrate, or belong. Sports, music, and public events became extensions of the brand. Stadiums, teams, and festivals carried the company's presence so deeply that beer and national pastimes became inseparable. This cultural saturation created loyalty that went beyond taste. Consumers didn't just drink beer, they chose sides. The brand became part of personal identity, family tradition, and regional pride. That loyalty translated into power. When a company controls what people celebrate with, it controls moments of joy, grief, and connection. Behind this influence was ruthless efficiency. Smaller breweries were crushed, absorbed, or starved out. Distribution networks were controlled tightly, ensuring that competitors struggled to reach customers. Taverns that wanted access to popular products often found themselves tied financially and contractually to the company. Choice existed, but only on the surface. The machine also shaped labor and class perception. It presented itself as a champion of workers while maintaining strict control over them. Jobs created loyalty, and loyalty created silence. Entire communities depended on the company's success, making resistance risky and criticism rare. In this way, Anheuser-Busch became untouchable not because it was loved, but because it was embedded everywhere. In government halls, in living rooms, in stadiums, and in celebrations. It didn't need to force influence, it normalized it. Beer was the product, but power was the business. The estate, Grant's Farm, presents itself as calm and inviting, but its quiet beauty conceals a far more unsettling reality. Beneath the manicured paths and elegant structures lies a history shaped by ruthless ambition. Ambition so intense that it demanded silence, obedience, and sacrifice from everyone who lived and worked within its boundaries. Ambition at the estate was never passive. It was enforced. Every decision made there served a single purpose, protecting the power and image of the family who owned it. People were not valued for who they were, but for how useful they could be. Loyalty mattered more than truth. Results mattered more than well-being. Anyone who failed to meet expectations simply disappeared from relevance, dismissed quietly, replaced without ceremony. Secrecy became the estate's most powerful weapon. What happened inside its gates rarely reached the outside world. Problems were not solved, they were hidden. Conflicts were not addressed, they were buried. Family disputes, emotional breakdowns, and moral compromises were sealed behind closed doors, protected by wealth and influence. Silence was not just encouraged, it was required. Speaking out risked jobs, reputations, and futures. For workers and staff, suffering was often invisible but constant. Long hours, strict rules, and absolute control defined daily life. Gratitude was expected, not earned. Fear lingered beneath politeness. As everyone understood that their livelihood depended on staying quiet and compliant. Smiles were part of the uniform. Pain had no place in the official story. Even within the family, the estate offered no refuge. Pressure to maintain dominance crushed vulnerability. Children grew up surrounded by privilege, but starved of freedom. Molded to serve a legacy rather than their own lives. Emotional struggles were seen as weakness. Personal desires were sacrificed for the sake of reputation. The estate witnessed isolation disguised as luxury. The most disturbing aspect of the suffering was how ordinary it became. Over time, control felt normal. Secrecy felt necessary. Ruthlessness felt justified. The estate did not erupt with scandal or violence. It drained people slowly, quietly, until exhaustion replaced resistance. That silence is what allowed the suffering to endure. What visitors see is serenity. What history remembers is success. But what the estate truly holds are the echoes of ambition taken too far. Voices that were never allowed to speak, struggles that were never acknowledged, and sacrifices that were never repaid. At Grant's farm, paradise was not something that existed naturally. It was manufactured, rehearsed, and tightly controlled. Every smiling worker, every well-kept path, every animal grazing in plain view was part of a carefully constructed performance, meant to convince visitors that harmony ruled the land. What appeared effortless was, in reality, the result of constant management and quiet pressure. Workers and servants were the backbone of this illusion. Their presence was meant to be felt but never noticed. They maintained beauty without leaving fingerprints. Rules governed how they spoke, where they walked, and even how they looked while working. Smiles were expected, questions were discouraged, and exhaustion was invisible. Their labor ensured that visitors saw perfection, while their own struggles remained hidden behind service entrances and private quarters. Servants understood that their value depended on discretion. Seeing too much or saying too much carried consequences. Privacy for the powerful was protected by the silence of those who served them. In return, workers were offered stability, but at the cost of autonomy. Gratitude replaced fairness, and loyalty replaced rights. The illusion required their compliance, and compliance became survival. The animals, too, played a role. They were symbols of abundance and peace, meant to suggest generosity and balance between wealth and nature. Visitors saw freedom and care, but behind that image was strict control. Animals were placed, managed, and displayed to reinforce a sense of wonder. They existed not just as living beings, but as props in a larger narrative of benevolent power. Nature itself was shaped to obey. Trees were planted for aesthetics, landscapes altered for visual impact, and environments curated to appear untouched. What looked wild was carefully designed. Disorder had no place here. The illusion of paradise depended on everything, people and animals alike, knowing their position and staying within it. This staging served a deeper purpose. By presenting the estate as peaceful and humane, it softened public perception of immense wealth and authority. Visitors left with admiration, not questions. Beauty distracted from hierarchy. Charm replaced scrutiny. The illusion worked because it was convincing, and it was convincing because so many invisible hands worked tirelessly to maintain it. Paradise, in this sense, was not a shared experience. It belonged to those at the top. For everyone else, it was a role to be played, a performance sustained by discipline, silence, and control. At Grant's farm, the idea of paradise did not emerge naturally. It was engineered with precision. Every pleasant detail that visitors admired was the result of planning, discipline, and constant supervision. The estate functioned like a theater, and everyone within it had a role to play. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was allowed to look strained, even when it was. Workers were essential to maintaining this illusion. Yet they were expected to exist in the background. Their labor shaped the beauty of the estate, but their presence was meant to fade into invisibility. They worked long hours to keep lawns perfect, buildings spotless, and paths welcoming. Fatigue, frustration, or personal hardship had no place in the image being sold. A peaceful setting demanded controlled expressions, politeness without personality, efficiency without complaint. Servants lived under even stricter expectations. They moved through the estate with caution, fully aware that discretion was their most valuable skill. They heard conversations they were not meant to remember, and saw moments they were not meant to acknowledge. Silence was not just professional, it was survival. Loyalty was measured not by dedication alone, but by how little of the truth escaped beyond the estate's boundaries. The animals, often seen as symbols of freedom and abundance, were carefully managed elements of the spectacle. Their presence suggested generosity, harmony, and a gentle relationship between wealth and nature. Visitors saw calm creatures in open spaces, reinforcing the illusion of kindness and balance. What they did not see was the rigid structure behind it all: controlled habitats, scheduled movement, and constant oversight designed to ensure the animals served their visual purpose. Even nature itself was part of the performance. Landscapes were sculpted to appear effortless, yet they required endless maintenance. Trees were planted where they looked best, not where they naturally belonged. Paths curved to guide attention. Views were designed to inspire calm and admiration. Wildness was allowed only when it could be managed. Chaos was unacceptable. This carefully staged paradise served a powerful function. It softened the image of immense wealth and authority. By surrounding power with beauty, the estate discouraged questions. Visitors left with pleasant memories rather than critical thoughts. The illusion transformed control into charm and dominance into generosity. For those who lived and worked there, however, paradise was not something they experienced, it was something they produced. Their lives were shaped by rules, expectations, and quiet restraint. While visitors admired harmony, workers maintained it at personal cost. The illusion endured because it demanded constant effort, discipline, and silence from those who made it possible. At Grant's farm, luxury did not bring peace, it amplified conflict. Behind polished doors and beneath chandeliers, tension lived permanently in the air. The mansion's grandeur became the stage for bitter family feuds, where wealth sharpened disagreements and inheritance turned love into rivalry. As the fortune grew, so did suspicion. Every conversation carried hidden meaning. Every gesture was measured. Family members no longer saw one another simply as relatives, but as potential threats to power and legacy. Trust eroded quietly, replaced by calculations about who would inherit control, who would be sidelined, and who would be remembered only as a footnote in the empire's history. Inheritance was never just about money. It was about authority. Control over the empire meant control over identity, reputation, and future generations. Decisions about succession sparked arguments that stretched for years, sometimes decades. Old wounds reopened during family gatherings that appeared elegant on the surface, but were poisoned underneath by resentment and fear. The mansion absorbed these conflicts silently. Its hallways witnessed confrontations spoken in whispers to avoid scandal. Its rooms hosted private negotiations disguised as family discussions. Legal strategies were planned alongside holiday dinners. Smiles hid rivalries that were growing more dangerous with time. Parents struggled to balance affection with ambition. Children were groomed, tested, and compared relentlessly. Favoritism bred resentment. Neglect bred rebellion. Some heirs felt trapped by expectations. Others consumed by entitlement. The mansion, meant to symbolize unity and strength, instead became a pressure chamber where emotions had no safe escape. Even death did not end the battles. Wills were contested, intentions questioned, and loyalties reassessed. Lawyers replaced relatives. Documents mattered more than memories. The dead became tools in ongoing power struggles, their wishes interpreted and reinterpreted to serve the living. What made these feuds especially haunting was their invisibility. To the outside world, the family appeared solid, dignified, and unshaken. Inside the mansion, however, relationships fractured slowly, leaving behind emotional damage that wealth could not repair. Luxury softened the setting, but intensified the pain. The halls remained beautiful, but they carried echoes of arguments never resolved, alliances never healed, and bonds broken beyond repair. The mansion did not just house the family's success, it held the cost of keeping it. The pressure to protect the Busch legacy was relentless, and behind closed doors it worked like a slow, quiet force of destruction. Within the Busch family, love was rarely unconditional. Relationships were measured against usefulness, loyalty, and obedience to the empire. Affection existed, but it was constantly overshadowed by expectation. From an early age, family members learned that they were not just individuals. They were representatives of a name that could not afford weakness. Personal desires were treated as distractions. Emotional struggles were viewed as liabilities. Every choice, from career paths to marriages, was weighed against how it might affect the family's image and control. Over time, this pressure turned communication into strategy and honesty into risk. Behind the mansion's closed doors, conversations were rarely simple. Words were chosen carefully, silences carried meaning, and disagreements were never just disagreements, they were power struggles. Siblings grew up competing rather than connecting, constantly compared and quietly judged. Success bred jealousy. Failure bred shame. Neither left much room for trust. Parents, burdened by the fear of losing control, often enforced expectations with emotional distance. Praise was rare and conditional. Approval had to be earned, and could be withdrawn just as easily. This created relationships built on performance rather than understanding. Children learned to hide their true selves, presenting only what was acceptable to the legacy. Marriages suffered under the same weight. Partners were evaluated not only as companions, but as assets or threats. Love that complicated the family narrative was discouraged. Conflicts that might have been resolved through openness instead hardened into resentment, because admitting vulnerability meant exposing cracks in the empire's armor. The tragedy was not loud or dramatic. It unfolded quietly, through missed connections, unspoken pain, and emotional isolation. Family members lived close together, yet remained distant, bound by blood, but separated by fear of disappointing the legacy. The mansion sheltered wealth, but it offered no shelter from this pressure. Over time, relationships eroded beyond repair. Forgiveness became difficult. Empathy faded. What remained was obligation, staying together not out of closeness, but out of necessity. The legacy survived, but it did so by consuming the very bonds that were meant to sustain it. Behind closed doors, the cost was paid in silence, broken trust, and relationships that never had the chance to breathe freely. Grant's farm existed on two levels at the same time, and that dual nature was no accident. To the outside world, it appeared welcoming, generous, almost wholesome, a place of animals, open land, and family-friendly charm. But behind that public-facing image, it operated as a sealed-off kingdom where power was concentrated, decisions were protected, and authority went unquestioned. As a private kingdom, Grant's farm was ruled by hierarchy. Access was everything. Certain areas were visible, others forbidden. Movement was controlled, information tightly managed. Those inside understood the invisible lines they were not meant to cross. Wealth allowed the family to exist beyond ordinary limits, shielded from scrutiny by land, distance, and influence. Within the estate, the family's rules mattered more than social norms, and loyalty outweighed truth. The estate gave its owners something most powerful people seek: isolation without invisibility. From behind its gates, business strategies could be planned, conflicts contained, and personal crises hidden. Mistakes didn't leak easily. Scandals could be softened or silenced before they ever reached the public. Grant's farm was not just a residence. It was a buffer between power and consequence. At the same time, the estate played a completely different role for the public. By opening parts of it to visitors, the family created an image of openness and generosity. People were invited in, but only into carefully curated spaces. What they saw felt authentic, but it was selective. The public areas acted as a distraction, drawing attention toward animals, scenery, and tradition, and away from the concentration of wealth and influence behind the scenes. This balance was strategic. A private kingdom thrives best when it is admired rather than questioned. By giving the public something pleasant to focus on, Grant's farm softened perceptions of excess and dominance. Visitors left with memories, not doubts. Beauty replaced scrutiny. Experience replaced inquiry. The estate's public face also built emotional loyalty. Families who visited associated the name with childhood memories and joy, not power and control. That emotional connection made criticism feel personal, even unfair. The distraction wasn't loud, it was comforting. And comfort is one of the most effective tools of influence. Inside the kingdom, however, life followed a different rhythm. Pressure, secrecy, and expectation shaped daily existence. Decisions made there affected industries, workers, and futures far beyond the estate's borders. Yet those consequences remained invisible to most who passed through its gates. Grant's farm succeeded because it never forced people to choose between these two realities. It allowed the public to see what they wanted to see, while the family preserved absolute control over what mattered most. A kingdom protected by charm, and a distraction built on beauty, both serving the same purpose: keeping power firmly in place. Alcohol and influence blended into a dangerous mix that reshaped not only an industry, but the people who controlled it. At the center of this mix stood Anheuser-Busch, a business built on a product that lowered inhibitions while raising dependence. This combination created a unique kind of authority, one that didn't rely on force, but on familiarity, habit, and emotional attachment. Alcohol gave the family access to everyday life. Their product was present at celebrations, victories, heartbreaks, and traditions. This constant presence translated into influence far beyond economics. When people relax with what you sell, they trust you. When communities build rituals around it, they defend you. That trust became leverage, and leverage became power. Power, once accumulated, demanded protection. Wealth funded political relationships, softened regulations, and ensured favorable treatment. Influence moved quietly. Through sponsorships, donations, and social connections that never appeared as commands, but functioned like them. Decisions that affected public health, labor, and culture were shaped behind closed doors, justified by economic importance and tradition. The danger of this mix lay in its normalization. Alcohol dulled resistance, not just socially but psychologically. Criticism was easier to dismiss when wrapped in humor, patriotism, or nostalgia. Influence felt benign because it arrived through entertainment, sports, and shared identity rather than authority. Power didn't announce itself, it blended in. Within the family, this mix became even more volatile. Alcohol blurred boundaries between work and personal life. Business discussions happened over drinks. Conflicts were numbed instead of resolved. Excess was excused as success. What might have been warning signs, addiction, denial, emotional instability, were often ignored because the empire was still growing. Influence also insulated consequences. When mistakes occurred, wealth and connections absorbed the impact. This created a dangerous feedback loop. Power reduced accountability. Alcohol encouraged excess, and influence ensured silence. Over time, this eroded internal discipline and distorted judgment. The very tools that built dominance began undermining stability. Outside the estate, communities depended on the company for jobs and identity, making resistance risky. Inside, family members struggled under expectations, magnified by excess and control. The mix did not explode dramatically, it corroded slowly, weakening relationships, ethics, and clarity. Power, alcohol, and influence did not simply coexist, they reinforced one another. Each made the other more potent and more destructive. Together, they created an environment where control felt natural, indulgence felt deserved, and consequences felt distant, until the cost became impossible to ignore. The estate, Grant's Farm, stands today not just as a landmark of success, but as a quiet reminder that greatness is rarely clean or uncomplicated. From a distance, it represents achievement, wealth earned, an empire built, a legacy secured. But when examined closely, its beauty begins to feel heavy, as if it carries the weight of everything that was sacrificed to make that greatness possible. Greatness demands ambition, and ambition often demands more than people are willing to admit. Behind the estate's elegance lie years of relentless pressure, unyielding expectations, and decisions made without mercy. For every symbol of triumph, there is a story of compromise. For every display of strength, there is a moment when empathy was set aside in favor of control. The estate does not reveal these stories openly, but it holds them all the same. The shadows are long because the impact was far-reaching. Families were shaped by fear of failure. Workers lived under silence. Relationships were bent to serve reputation. Even joy, when it appeared, was carefully measured, so it did not threaten the image of strength. What the public admired as greatness often required private endurance, emotional loss, and quiet suffering. The darkness is not found in scandal or collapse, but in endurance. The ability to maintain power for so long required constant vigilance, constant suppression of weakness, and constant sacrifice of honesty. Over time, this created an environment where success became inseparable from isolation. The higher the estate rose as a symbol, the further it drifted from ordinary human connection. What makes the reminder so powerful is that the estate still stands. It has outlived arguments, ambitions, and even the people who fought hardest to control it. The walls remain beautiful, but they are lined with memories of tension, expectation, and restraint. The grounds are peaceful, but that peace was engineered, not earned. The estate teaches a quiet lesson without speaking it aloud: greatness is not free. It casts shadows that stretch across generations. touching lives that never asked to be part of an empire. Wealth can preserve structures, but it cannot erase the cost of building them. And in the stillness of the estate, those shadows linger, not dramatic, not visible, but deeply present, reminding anyone who looks closely that power always leaves a mark. Grant's farm appears, at first glance, like a dream carefully preserved in time. Rolling green land, elegant buildings, animals roaming calmly, everything about it suggests peace, generosity, and tradition. But this estate was never built merely to comfort or inspire. It was constructed as a declaration, a message carved into land and stone that power had arrived, and it intended to stay. Owned by the Busch family, the estate became the physical embodiment of an empire that rose from immigrant hardship to untouchable dominance. Their early struggle shaped them, but it did not soften them. It taught them that survival required control, and control required visibility. Grant's farm was not hidden away. It stood boldly, designed to be seen, admired, and unquestioned. Every element of the estate reinforced hierarchy. The long approaches forced visitors to slow down, to absorb scale and authority before ever reaching the doors. Boundaries were clear, access was selective, and movement was never accidental. Inside, rooms were not just rooms, they were signals of status. Some were built for command, others for service. Silence itself became a rule. The empire behind the estate, Anheuser-Busch, was never just a brewery. It was a cultural and political machine, powered by alcohol, influence, and money. Beer flowed into everyday American life, into celebrations, traditions, and identity itself. That presence created trust, and trust created leverage. When people depend on what you sell, they begin to defend you without realizing it. Power accumulated quietly. Laws softened. Critics faded. Communities grew dependent. Influence didn't arrive as force. It arrived as familiarity. Wrapped in patriotism, sports, and nostalgia, control felt harmless. It felt earned. And that made it dangerous. Within Grant's farm, paradise was staged with precision. Workers and servants were essential, yet meant to disappear into the background. They labored endlessly to maintain perfection, bound by rules that governed speech, posture, and discretion. Smiles were expected. Questions were not. Their silence protected privacy, and their obedience preserved illusion. The animals, too, played their role. They symbolized harmony and generosity, suggesting a gentle balance between wealth and nature. But even nature here was controlled. Landscapes were designed, movement was managed, and wildness was allowed only when it behaved. What visitors saw as freedom was, in truth, order made beautiful. Behind the elegance, ambition ruled without mercy. Secrecy was the estate's strongest defense. Problems were hidden rather than solved. Conflicts were buried rather than healed. Those who did not fit the image were quietly removed. Suffering did not announce itself. It endured silently, normalized by routine and necessity. Inside the family, wealth did not bring unity. It intensified fear. Inheritance was not about money alone. It was about authority. Who would control the empire? Who would be trusted? Who would be discarded? Conversations became negotiations. Love competed with legacy. Siblings became rivals. Parents enforced expectations with distance rather than warmth. The pressure to protect the family name destroyed relationships quietly. Personal desires were treated as threats. Vulnerability was weakness. Approval was conditional and easily withdrawn. Marriages were scrutinized. Children were shaped to serve a future they did not choose. Behind closed doors, the mansion echoed with arguments softened by luxury, but sharpened by resentment. Alcohol, the foundation of the empire, blurred boundaries even further. Excess was excused as success. Warning signs were ignored because growth continued. Power insulated consequences. Influence ensured silence. A dangerous loop formed, one where control felt permanent and accountability felt optional. Grant's farm functioned as two places at once. To the family, it was a private kingdom, sealed, protected, and governed by its own rules. To the public, it was a distraction. By opening carefully curated parts of the estate, admiration replaced scrutiny. Visitors saw charm, not control. Beauty softened dominance. Experience replaced inquiry. The estate still stands today, peaceful and impressive. But it carries weight. Its walls hold memories of ambition taken too far, of silence demanded, of relationships sacrificed for permanence. It reminds us that greatness is rarely innocent. That empires are not built without cost. And that the shadows cast by power stretch far longer than the light that first created it.